An elderly war veteran lay curled on the road, his body buried under snow, his face bruised by the fists of his own son. He didn't fall because of war. He fell because he was abandoned by the family he once protected. Paperwork, money, guardianship. Can documents and material wealth crush blood ties, turning a father into a case meant to be erased? No one stopped. No one asked. Only the cold slowly pulled him away from the world, until a Navy SEAL passed through town and felt something wasn't right. And his dog froze, stared into the snow, and refused to take another step. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories like this touch you, please like and subscribe. One follow is enough to help us keep telling the stories that have been forgotten. And now, let's begin the story. The road curved along the edge of the lake, like a thought that refused to end. Morning had already broken fully by the time Elias Crow reached the northern town. Bright, honest light, the kind that made everything look simpler than it was. Sunlight slid across the frozen skin of the water, turning patches of thin ice into pale mirrors. Pines stood tall along the shoreline, their needles dark and still, as if they were holding their breath. Elias drove with both hands on the wheel, posture straight, shoulders square. 35 years old, 6 feet tall, lean in the way men became when they learned long ago that excess only slowed you down. His face was clean-shaven, the sharp line of his jaw exposed to the cold, cheekbones cut clean by years of wind and discipline, his hair dark brown, was military short but grown just beyond regulation, caught the light when he turned his head, revealing faint silver threads near the temples that had nothing to do with age. He wore the same clothes he had worn for weeks. An old olive-gray tactical combat shirt clung to his frame, the fabric softened by time and repetition. The cuffs were frayed, the shoulders dulled where straps had once rubbed. At the collar, a darker red thermal layer showed through. Warmth beneath restraint. His combat pants were earth-toned, brown fading into moss green, knees scuffed, cargo pockets sagging with memory more than weight. Old military work boots rested heavy on the pedals, leather scarred and honest. On his wrist, a scratched military watch ticked steadily, indifferent to where he was or why. Elias hadn't planned to be here. That was the truth he hadn't spoken out loud, not to anyone, not even to himself. He had been driving north because the road went that way, because the air got cleaner the farther he went. Signsn. Because silence felt easier when it had space. In the passenger seat sat Orion. The German shepherd lay curled but alert, 5 years old, coat a blend of cream, gray, and black that shifted with the light. His body was all controlled strength muscle without waste, movement without hurry. A black harness wrapped his chest, trimmed in dark red, a handle resting between his shoulders like a promise. His amber eyes were half-lidded, watching the world slide past through the window. Orion had not slept. Elias knew the signs. The dog's breathing was too even, too measured. His ears flicked at sounds most people missed. The crunch of distant tires on gravel, the echo of a gull's cry across the lake, the faint metallic hum of power lines buried beneath the road. "You can relax," Elias said quietly, his voice low, calm. The way he spoke to Orion was the way he spoke to himself when he remembered to try. We're just passing through." Orion did not look at him. The town appeared without ceremony. A cluster of buildings near the water, a gas station, a bakery with fogged windows, a modest medical center set slightly back from the road. Flags hung limp in the cold air. There was nothing dramatic about it. No sign that anything waited here. Elias slowed automatically, habit more than choice. He felt the truck settle, felt the hum of the engine change pitch beneath his boots. The military part of his brain, never off, only quieter, catalogued exits, sightlines, distances. And then Orion's breathing changed. It was subtle. Anyone else might have missed it. But Elias had lived with this dog through 2 deployments and more nights than he could count. The rhythm shortened, tightened. Muscles along Orion's shoulders went rigid, the harness shifting as his weight redistributed forward. His ears rotated, not toward a sound, but toward a direction, left, toward the medical center. Elias's hands tightened on the wheel. "What is it?" he asked. Orion rose halfway, bracing his front paws against the door, nose lifted, drawing the air in slow, deliberate pulls. Not frantic, focused. This wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The truck coasted. Elias hadn't decided to turn. His hands did it before his thoughts caught up. The tires crunched onto a side drive that led behind the medical center, toward a wide, half-empty parking area dusted with old salt and thin snow. The sun was high now, clear and cold, the kind of morning that felt clean enough to forgive things. The engine idled. Orion let out a low, unfamiliar sound, not a bark, not a whine, something in between. He pressed his nose harder to the glass, breath fogging the window. "Easy," Elias murmured, though his pulse had already shifted. "Show me." He cut the engine, but the cold hit him the moment he opened the door, sharp and precise, slipping through fabric to find skin. Orion was out before Elias's boots touched the ground, moving with controlled urgency across the lot. Not running. Tracking. Elias followed, stride long and economical, senses waking fully now. The smell of salt, gasoline, cold water. Somewhere nearby, bread baking. Somewhere else, old metal and something faintly sour. They moved past the back of the medical center toward a low service structure, a shed or storage building used for maintenance, its walls stained with years of weather. Snow had drifted unevenly along the concrete, leaving patches of bare ground dark with moisture. Orion slowed. He lowered his head, circling once, twice, then stopped. Instead of barking or pulling forward, he lay down. Flat. Belly to the ground, chin resting between his paws, eyes fixed on the narrow space between the building and a stack of pallets half covered by a tarp. Elias felt his chest tighten. That position meant something. It wasn't trained for explosives or weapons. It was what Orion did when the answer required hands, not teeth. When what he had found could not be confronted, only revealed. Elias stepped around the pallets. At first, he thought it was trash. A bundle of old coats, cardboard crushed by moisture. Then he saw the boots. They were wrong. Too deliberate, too worn in the way that came from years of use, not neglect. A man lay curled on his side against the wall, knees drawn tight to his chest, arms crossed as if he could hold his own heat in by force alone. The man was old. 70, maybe more. white hair tangled against a concrete edge. A beard grown without care, not wild, but tired. His skin was pale beneath the grime, lips tinged blue. His jacket, a green field coat, was threadbare, the fabric thinned at the elbows, seams stressed by time. And pinned to the chest of that jacket was a faded patch, so worn the emblem was barely visible, but Elias knew it anyway. His breath caught, just once. "Sir," Elias said, dropping to one knee. His voice had shifted into something else now, steady, clipped, precise. "Can you hear me?" No response. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the man's neck. The pulse was there, but slow, fragile. Hypothermia. Advanced. Elias moved without hesitation. He shrugged out of his own outer layer, wrapped it around the man's torso, hands firm but careful. The weight of the body was wrong, too light for the frame. Starvation, his mind supplied. Uninvited. Behind him, Orion rose and stepped closer, pressing his flank against the man's legs, warmth offered without instruction. His amber eyes flicked up once to Elias, then back to the man, as if to say, "I'll hold this part." Elias lifted the man, every muscle working in quiet coordination, and carried him toward the truck. The world narrowed to steps, breath, the way cold bit into his knuckles. As he laid the man across the back seat and cranked the heat to its highest setting, something brushed Elias's wrist. A movement. The man's eyes opened. They were brown, clouded with exhaustion, but there was something sharp beneath it, awareness, that refused to go quietly. "Don't," the man rasped. His voice sounded like paper tearing. "Don't call my son." Elias froze. Orion's ears pricked just slightly. "Okay," Elias said after a beat. His voice softened, losing none of its certainty. "I won't." The man's gaze drifted, unfocused, then settled on Orion. For a moment, something like recognition passed across his face. "Good dog," he whispered. Orion's tail thumped once against the seat. Elias closed the door and moved around to the driver's side, heart beating harder now, not from exertion, but from something else entirely. He slid behind the wheel, hands steady, mind racing. He hadn't meant to stop. He hadn't meant to stay. But the dog had smelled the morning and the morning, it seemed. I had been waiting. As Elias pulled the truck toward the front entrance of the medical center, sunlight flashed across the lake behind him, breaking through a sheet of ice with a sound too soft to hear. Sometimes the world didn't shout. Sometimes it waited for you to listen. The emergency room was warmer than Elias expected, not just in temperature, but in sound. The low hum of machines, the muted rhythm of footsteps, the soft rustle of fabric and gloves. After the sharp clarity of the parking lot, the air inside felt padded, as if the building itself were trying to cushion whatever pain crossed its threshold. Elias stood just inside the curtain, hands resting loosely at his sides. His combat shirt was still damp at the cuffs where snow had melted into the fabric. He hadn't noticed until now. Orion lay on the floor near the foot of the bed, body angled so he could see both the door and the man on the gurney. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, calm but alert. Amber eyes tracking movement with quiet intelligence. The old man Frank, was they'd learned his name moments ago, lay under a stack of warming blankets. His skin had regained a hint of color, though the lines in his face remained deep, carved by years that had not been gentle. His hair, once white and unruly, had been smoothed back by a nurse with practiced hands. When his eyes were open, They were startlingly clear. A nurse stepped in, chart tucked against her chest. Her name tag read Sarah Whitmore. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender in a way that spoke of long shifts and little time to eat properly. Her light brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, a few loose strands escaping to brush against a freckled cheek. There was a softness to her face, but not fragility. Her eyes were steady, observant, the kind that had seen too much fear to be easily shaken by it. "He's stable," Sarah said quietly, addressing Elias more than the patient. "Core temperature is coming up. Blood pressure's low, but improving." "Thank you," Elias replied. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. He cleared his throat. Sarah glanced at Orion, then back at Elias. "Your dog didn't leave his side." "He won't," Elias said. It wasn't pride, just fact. Frank shifted slightly, a small sound escaping him. Sarah stepped closer to the bed, adjusting a monitor. Elias watched her movements efficient, gentle, practiced. She'd done this before, many times. "Sir," she said to Frank, her tone warm but direct. "You're at North Shore Medical. You were found outside. You're safe." Frank's eyes flicked to her face, then past her, landing on Elias. Recognition sparked there, followed by something like calculation. "I told him," Frank rasped. "No phone calls." Sarah paused, fingers stilling on the chart. "No phone calls to whom?" she asked. Frank swallowed. "My son." The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. Sarah looked to Elias, brows knitting slightly, not in judgment, but in question. Elias shook his head once, subtle. "He asked me not to," Elias said. Frank exhaled, relief softening his expression just a fraction. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." Sarah studied Frank for a moment longer, then nodded. "We'll respect that for now," she said carefully. "But there may be paperwork." Frank's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something sharper. "There's always paperwork," he said. They moved Frank to a private room overlooking a stand of pines dusted with snow. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting pale lines across the walls. It was a gentler place to wake up. Elias sat in the chair near the window, forearms resting on his thighs. Orion repositioned himself, settling closer to the bed now, chin resting on the mattress edge. Frank's hand drifted down automatically, fingers brushing the thick fur behind Orion's ear. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing briefly. "Good boy," Frank said again, stronger this time. Orion's tail thumped once against the floor. Frank looked at Elias then. Really looked at him, as if cataloging details the way Elias had cataloged rooms his whole life. "You military," Frank said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." "Navy?" "Yes, sir." Frank nodded slowly. "Figures?" Something in his tone suggested not admiration, but familiarity. Elias felt it like a quiet acknowledgement between men who spoke the same language without needing the words. A knock sounded at the door. The woman who entered wore a dark green uniform, badge pinned cleanly to her chest. Sheriff Mara Keene. She was in her mid-40s, broad-shouldered, her posture relaxed, but ready. Short dark hair streaked with early gray framed a face weathered by years of wind and worry. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, the kind that missed little and forgot less. "Morning," she said, voice even. I'm Sheriff Keene. Frank's gaze hardened, not in fear, but in guarded resolve. Didn't ask for the law, he said. I know, Mara replied calmly. But someone found you nearly frozen behind a medical center. Makes it my business whether you like it or not. Frank huffed a weak laugh. Fair enough. Mara turned to Elias. You the one who found him? Yes, ma'am. She studied him for a beat, eyes tracing the worn edges of his clothing, the discipline in his stance. You local? No, ma'am. Thought not. She nodded once. Your dog? Yes, ma'am. Mara's gaze dropped to Orion. The shepherd met it without flinching. Hell of a partner, she said. He is, Elias agreed. Mara pulled a small notebook from her pocket. I'm going to ask a few questions, Mr. Halverson, Frank said. Frank Halverson. Mara wrote it down. Mr. Halverson, do you have a place to stay? Frank hesitated. No, he said finally. Mara's pen paused. Family? Another beat. Longer this time. I have a son, Frank said. That's not the same thing. Elias felt Orion tense slightly beneath Frank's hand. Mara glanced up, catching the shift. We can talk later if you need, she said. But I'll be honest with you. I need to know if someone put you out there. Frank's jaw tightened. The lines in his face deepened. I put myself there, he said, after I was told where I was allowed to be. Mara's eyes narrowed. Allowed by whom? Frank closed his eyes. Paper, he said. Paper said I didn't belong anywhere else. As if responding to the word, Orion suddenly lifted his head, not abruptly, not alarmed. He stood, turned toward the door, and positioned his body squarely between the bed and the hallway. His ears angled forward, his stance steady and deliberate, not aggressive, but absolute. Everyone in the room went still. Mara's hand drifted instinctively toward her belt. Elias's pulse spiked, every sense tuning sharp, but no one entered. The hallway beyond the door remained empty. After a long moment, Orion relaxed, just enough to sit, still blocking the doorway. Frank stared at the dog, breath shallow. He does that, Frank said quietly, almost to himself. When someone's about to lie. The words settled into the room like dust. No one spoke. They continued more carefully after that. Frank spoke in pieces at first, each sentence measured, chosen. He explained how, after a fall the previous winter, nothing serious, just ice and bad timing, his son had insisted on helping with finances. How forms had been signed, how evaluations had been scheduled over the phone. How long were those calls? Mara asked. 15 minutes, Frank said. 20, maybe. Long enough to ask my birthday and what year it was. And now? Frank opened his eyes. Now the same paper says I can't decide where I sleep. Sarah had returned quietly, standing near the wall, listening. Her hands clenched around her chart. That's not how it's supposed to work, she said softly. Frank looked at her. Supposed to is a suggestion, he replied, not a rule. Mara exhaled through her nose. Do you know the name of the attorney involved? Frank nodded. Black Pine Trust, he said. They don't call themselves an attorney. They call themselves a solution. Elias felt something cold slide down his spine. Mara wrote the name down. I'll look into it. Frank's gaze flicked to Elias. You don't have to stay, he said. You did enough. Elias looked at Orion, then back at Frank. I can sit, he said. Frank studied him, then nodded once. Good, he said. Paper doesn't like witnesses. Outside, The pines shifted as a breeze moved through them, sunlight glinting off melting snow. Inside, something heavier than cold had found its way into the room, and it wasn't leaving quietly. By late morning, the town had fully woken. Sunlight spilled across the main street in clean, pale bands, reflecting off windows and the thin crust of old snow piled along the curbs. A bakery door opened and closed with steady rhythm, releasing warm air scented with yeast and sugar. Somewhere down by the lake, metal rang softly, someone working on a dock, preparing for ice out that would come weeks from now. Elias stepped outside the medical center and filled his lungs. Cold, bright, honest. It felt different from the cold that lived in memory, the kind that crept in during long nights overseas, damp and relentless. This cold clarified. It sharpened edges instead of dulling them. Behind him, Orion padded out the door, nails clicking softly on the concrete before finding traction on salt-dusted pavement. The German shepherd paused at Elias's side, head lifted, nose working. His cream-gray-black coat caught the light, each strand defined, his harness dark against his chest, red trim muted but present. He looked like a creature built to exist exactly where he stood. "You're liking this place too much," Elias muttered, more to himself than the dog. Orion's ears flicked, but he didn't disagree. Sheriff Mara Keene waited near her patrol truck, one boot propped casually on the bumper. In daylight, she looked even more solid mid-40s, thick jacket stretched across broad shoulders. The lines around her eyes earned the hard way. Her expression was neutral, but not closed. She held a coffee in one gloved hand, steam curling upward. "I've got someone I want you to meet," she said, nodding toward the street. "If you're willing to walk." "I can walk," Elias replied. They fell into step, Orion pacing smoothly between them, slightly ahead. People glanced as they passed, some curious, some cautious. Dogs in small-town America were common. Dogs that moved like Orion drew longer looks. The office sat above a hardware store, its sign modest. Sloan Legal Aid. The stairs creaked underfoot as they climbed, wood worn smooth by decades of use. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and coffee left too long on a burner. The man who rose from behind the desk looked like he'd been assembled from mismatched parts. Adrian Sloan was in his late 30s, tall but slouched, dark hair curling where it refused to obey comb or intention. He wore a gray sweater over a collared shirt, sleeves pushed up to reveal ink-stained cuffs. Wireframe glasses perched slightly crooked on his nose. His face was narrow, jaw lightly shadowed with stubble that suggested he shaved when he remembered. His eyes, however, were sharp, quick, assessing, alive. "Sheriff," Adrian said, offering a lopsided smile. "Us, if you're here to tell me my parking ticket doubled again, I maintain it's a clerical vendetta." "Adrian," Mara replied dryly. "Meet Elias Crow." Adrian extended a hand. Elias took it. The grip was firm, brief testing, not competing. "And this," Mara added, "is the reason I'm here." Orion sat without being asked, posture straight, gaze fixed calmly on Adrian. Adrian's eyebrows rose. "Well," he said slowly, "hello to you too." Orion did not move. "He doesn't usually sit like that," Elias said. "Is that good or bad?" Adrian asked. "Depends on the room," Elias replied. Mara cut in. "Frank Halverson." Adrian's expression shifted just a fraction, The humor thinned, replaced by focus. "That was fast," he said. "You know the name?" Elias asked. "I know the pattern," Adrian replied. He gestured toward a chair. "Sit, all of you, or," he glanced at Orion, "most of you." Orion remained seated, unbothered. Adrian leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms. "Elder guardianship," he said. It's supposed to be a safety net, but nets can be used to trap." Mara nodded. "He mentioned Black Pine Trust." Adrian's mouth tightened. "Of course he did." "You've heard of them," Elias said. "I've argued with them," Adrian corrected. "Lost twice, won once. Each time felt like pushing against a wall that knew the law better than I did." He reached for a folder on the desk, flipping it open. Inside were notes, clippings, printouts, names highlighted, margins crowded with handwriting. "They're not a single firm," Adrian continued. "They're a shell, or a knot, depending on how you look at it. Legal services, financial management, care placement, all wrapped in language that sounds helpful enough to pass initial review." Elias listened, eyes on the papers, mind assembling pieces. He thought of Frank's voice. Paper doesn't like witnesses. "What happens when someone pushes back?" Elias asked. Adrian sighed. "Usually, nothing dramatic. That's the problem. No bruises, or no broken bones. Just forms, delays, evaluations done remotely, assets frozen for protection." "And people end up where?" Mara asked. "Facilities," Adrian said. "Or nowhere. Depends on how profitable they are." Orion shifted. It was subtle. His weight moved from haunch to forepaws, head angling toward the open window. A breeze carried in the smell of lake water, metal, something old and damp. Elias noticed. "So what do we do?" Mara asked. Adrian closed the folder. "We learn the town," he said. "These things don't happen in isolation. Someone signs, someone transports, someone looks the other way." Outside, a bell chimed noon. They walked the town after that, not like investigators, but like people with nowhere else to be. They passed the post office, the library, a diner with red vinyl booths visible through the glass. Elias caught fragments of conversation weather, fishing, school closures, normal life, layered over quieter truths. Orion led without pulling, choosing routes that made no obvious sense, down a side street, across a small park where the grass showed through snow in stubborn patches, toward the lake. At the edge of the water stood a row of storage sheds and old boathouses, paint peeling, wood silvered by years of wind. The smell here was stronger cold iron, algae trapped beneath ice. Orion slowed. Elias stopped with him. "What is it?" Mara asked, scanning the area. "I don't know yet," Elias said. Orion circled once, nose low, then moved toward a narrow structure set back from the others. The door hung crooked, one hinge rusted through. No sign marked it, no lock held it closed. Adrian frowned. "That shed's been unused for years." Orion sat. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the awareness that something had already been decided. Inside, the air was stale. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boards, illuminating dust and the shapes of stacked boxes. Nothing dramatic. No bodies, no weapons. Just paper, folders, envelopes. Files bound with twine, water-stained but legible, names written in careful ink. Elias knelt, lifting one gently. He did not open it. He didn't need to. "Someone didn't want to throw this away," Adrian said quietly. "They hid it." Mara's jaw set. "We'll log it," By the book. Orion stood close to Elias, pressing his shoulder against Elias's leg, as if to say, "This is enough for now." As they stepped back into the light, Elias felt it before he understood it, a sensation like being watched, but without direction. He turned slowly. Across the lake, on the far shore, a figure stood still among the trees. Too far to see clearly. Just the outline of a person, unmoving, dark against the pale ice. Elias blinked. The figure was gone. Orion stared at the empty space for a long moment, then looked up at Elias, not alert, not alarmed, expectant. They returned to the medical center in the afternoon. Frank slept, breathing deeper now, color improved. Sarah moved quietly in the room. Am adjusting a line, smoothing a blanket. She looked tired, but resolved. "He asked for you," she whispered to Elias. Frank's eyes opened as Elias approached. They focused quickly. "You walked the town," Frank said. "Yes, sir." "Did it answer you?" Elias hesitated. "Some?" Frank nodded, as if that were exactly what he'd expected. His hand found Orion's fur again. "Maps don't tell you where to go," Frank murmured. "They just tell you where people have been brave enough to leave a mark." Outside the window, the lake held its light. The town, it seemed, had begun to draw its lines. The hospital changed tone after sunset. Not dramatically, no alarms, no rushing feet, but in the way buildings seemed to exhale once visiting hours ended. The overhead lights dimmed a fraction. Voices softened. Even the floors seemed to absorb sound instead of throwing it back. Elias sat in a molded plastic chair outside Frank Halverson's room, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. The posture came naturally. Waiting had been part of his life longer than action ever was. Orion lay at his feet, long body curved into a loose crescent, chin resting on his paws. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd was past the reckless intensity of youth, but nowhere near softness. His breathing was slow, even. His ears, however, never fully relaxed. Inside the room, a muted conversation carried through the half-closed door. Sarah Bennett stood near the bed, checking a monitor. In the low light, she looked slimmer than she had earlier, tall, straight-backed, shoulders slightly sloped from long hours leaning over patients. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a tight knot at the nape of her neck, a few loose strands catching the light. Her skin had the faint pallor of someone who worked nights by choice or necessity, and her eyes held a tired kindness, sharpened by skepticism. Frank was awake, not fully alert, not drifting present. His hands rested on the blanket, fingers curled loosely, the bronze star no longer pinned to his jacket but placed carefully on the bedside table, as if it were a compass rather than a medal. "They want a review," Sarah said quietly. "Internal Ethics Committee, Administration, Legal Liaison, a social worker." Frank gave a short, breathless laugh. "That sounds like a room full of people deciding who I belong to." Sarah didn't flinch. "It's also a room where you can speak." Frank's gaze shifted toward the door, toward Elias, though he couldn't see him clearly from the bed. "Will he be there?" Frank asked. "If you want him there," Sarah said. "Yes." Frank nodded once. "I want him there." Sheriff Mara Keene arrived 10 minutes later, coat unbuttoned, hat tucked under one arm. She looked more tired than she had that morning, jaw tight, eyes shadowed, but there was a steadiness to her that hadn't faded. "They've been calling my office," she said, lowering her voice as she stopped beside Elias. "County, state. Someone from Black Pine Trust left a message that sounded polite enough to be a threat." Elias didn't react outwardly. That fast? Mara snorted softly. You don't poke a hive without something buzzing. Adrian Sloane followed shortly after, carrying a slim briefcase that looked too light to matter. He'd changed clothes, a darker sweater, with cleaner lines, but the same restless energy clung to him. His eyes flicked to Orion immediately. Still watching? Adrian murmured. Always, Elias said. Orion's tail tapped the floor once, slow and deliberate. The conference room sat at the end of the hall, windowless, its walls painted a neutral beige meant to discourage strong feelings. A long table dominated the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. A pot of coffee steamed weakly on a side counter. Untouched. 3 people waited inside. Helen Crowley, the hospital's legal liaison, rose first. She was in her early 50s, hair cut in a precise silver bob, glasses perched low on her nose. Her suit was tailored to the point of severity. She moved like someone who had learned to occupy space without apology. Beside her sat Dr. Paul Mendez, head of internal medicine. Short, compact, dark hair graying at the temples. His white coat hung open, stethoscope tucked into a pocket out of habit rather than need. His eyes were sharp, analytical, but not unkind. The third was Lila Rosen, a county social worker in her late 20s. She wore a soft cardigan over a blouse, notebook clutched to her chest like armor. Her posture was tentative, but her gaze held curiosity rather than fear. Frank entered slowly, supported by a rolling IV stand and Sarah's steady presence at his side. Elias rose instinctively. Orion stood with him, then sat again once Frank was settled. "This is not a trial," Helen Crowley began, folding her hands. "This is a review. Mr. Halverson, we are here to determine whether your current guardianship arrangement serves your best interests." Frank looked at her for a long moment. "And who decides what my interests are?" Helen met his gaze without blinking. "The law." Frank nodded. "That's what I thought." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "And the law allows for reassessment," he said calmly. "Especially when new information comes to light." Helen's eyes flicked to the briefcase. "Information must be verified." Mara crossed her arms. "It will be." The room settled into a careful silence. Frank spoke first. Not loudly. Not emotionally. He spoke the way he might have once spoken to a classroom, measured, patient, deliberate. He described the phone calls he didn't remember making, the papers he remembered signing, but not understanding. The moment he realized his accounts were no longer his, the facility he'd been transferred to without explanation, the way questions were met with reassurances that felt like walls. As he spoke, Elias watched the room rather than the man. Helen Crowley's pen paused at odd intervals. Dr. Mendez frowned, tapping a finger against the table. Lila Rosen's grip on her notebook tightened, knuckles whitening. Orion did not move. When Frank finished, Sarah added clinical detail lab results, responsiveness, orientation tests. She spoke with quiet authority, and her voice steady despite the weight of implication. "This patient is lucid," she concluded, "consistently. He understands the nature of these proceedings." Dr. Mendez nodded slowly. "I concur." Helen exhaled through her nose. "Competence is not the sole factor." "No," Adrian agreed, "but it is the foundation." A sound cut through the room. Not loud, just wrong. Orion's head lifted instantly. His ears snapped forward, body tensing so quickly Elias felt it through the air rather than saw it. "What is that?" Lila whispered. Elias stood, eyes scanning the door, the ceiling, the vents. The sound came again, a faint metallic scrape, like a cart being moved where no cart should be. Orion rose, stepped to the door, and placed himself squarely in front of it. He did not growl. He simply refused to move. The sound stopped. A beat passed, then another. Mara's hand rested lightly on her belt. Adrian's fingers tightened on his briefcase handle. Helen's expression flickered uncertainty, breaking through control for half a second. Probably maintenance," Helen said, too quickly. Orion remained where he was, gaze fixed on the door. After a long moment, he sat. The room exhaled. Elias did not. The meeting resumed, but the air had changed. The walls felt thinner, the language more careful. Helen cleared her throat. "Given the circumstances, I will recommend a temporary suspension of guardianship pending a full external review." Frank closed his eyes briefly, not in relief recognition. "Thank you," he said. Lila Rosen spoke up, voice quiet but firm. "I'd like to file a parallel report with the county. There are inconsistencies here that warrant broader attention." Helen hesitated, then nodded once. "Noted." Dr. Mendez stood. "I'll order a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. In person. Documented." Adrian allowed himself a small, restrained smile. The meeting ended without ceremony. Later, back in Frank's room, the lights dimmed further. Sarah adjusted his blanket, her movements gentle. "You did well," she said. Frank smiled faintly. "I had good backup." His gaze shifted to Orion, who lay beside the bed now, head resting near Frank's hand. "Dogs know," Frank murmured. "They don't need paperwork." Elias leaned against the wall, exhaustion creeping in around the edges of his awareness. This kind of fight-slow procedural was harder than anything that required speed. Outside, the town settled into night. Snow began to fall again, light and steady, softening edges. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, systems were already adjusting, recalculating. But for now, in this quiet room, the paper walls had cracked, and something real had stepped through. Snow fell harder by morning. Not the gentle kind that softened the world, but thick, wet flakes that blurred edges and pressed weight onto everything they touched. Elias noticed it first through sound, the muted hush outside the hospital windows, the way tires hissed instead of hummed on the road below. Pressure always announced itself quietly. He stood at the window at the end of the corridor, coffee cooling in his hand, Orion at his side. The dog's breath fogged the glass in short, steady bursts. 5 years old, German Shepherd, built lean and efficient cream and gray, layered over darker black along his back. The black harness hugged his chest, red trim worn but intact. He looked outward, not searching, just watching. "You feel it too," Elias murmured. Orion's ears angled, acknowledging but not confirming. The call came just after 8. Mara Keen's voice carried no greeting. "They filed." Elias closed his eyes once. "Already?" "Emergency motion. Injunction request. They're claiming procedural overreach, reputational harm, and interference with fiduciary duty." "Black Pine Trust?" Elias asked, though he knew the answer. "Through a subsidiary," Mara said. 3 layers deep. But yes. Elias exhaled slowly. "Where?" County Courthouse. Hearings tomorrow morning. The line went quiet for half a second. Then Mara added, They want Frank transferred. Today. Elias turned from the window. Orion turned with him, movement synchronized without thought. On what grounds? Elias asked. Medical necessity, Mara replied. They're saying the hospital can't guarantee continuity of care during a legal dispute. That's bullshit, Elias said flatly. I know, Mara replied. But it's clean bullshit. Paper clean. Sarah Bennett met them at Frank's door. She looked different in daylight, more composed. Was the tension of the night shift replaced by something sharper? Her dark blonde hair was braided now, practical, efficient. Her scrubs were clean, pressed, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to them. She held a tablet against her chest, fingers tight around the edge. They sent a representative, she said quietly. Black Pine. He's downstairs. Administration's with him. Frank was awake, alert, his color better than it had been in days. He listened without interrupting, hands folded loosely on the blanket. When Sarah finished, he nodded. I figured they wouldn't like being told no, he said. They're pushing for transfer, Sarah added. Legally, they might get it, unless we block. Elias met Frank's eyes. Do you want to leave? Frank's gaze dropped to Orion, who stood beside the bed now, tail still, posture attentive. No, Frank said. I want to stay exactly where I am. Then we fight, Elias replied. The representative arrived mid-morning. Caleb Rhodes looked like he'd stepped out of a brochure meant to inspire trust. Early 40s, tall, clean-cut, hair neatly parted with just enough gray to signal experience. His suit was navy, expensive, but understated. His tie bore a subtle pattern that suggested intention without ostentation. His smile was practiced, but not insincere, just flexible. Mr. Crow, he said smoothly, extending a hand. Caleb Rhodes, Black Pine Trust. Elias shook his hand once, released it. Rhodes glanced down at Orion, eyebrows lifting a fraction. Impressive animal. He's working, Elias said. Rhodes chuckled lightly. Of course he is. They sat across from each other in a smaller administrative office glass walls, neutral decor, a view of falling snow. Helen Crowley sat at the head of the table, composed as ever. A second administrator hovered near the door, silent, uncomfortable. We respect the hospital's concern, Rhodes began. But Mr. Halverson's guardianship agreement predates this incident. Our obligation is to ensure his long-term stability. And your definition of stability involves moving him, Elias said. Continuity, Rhodes corrected. Familiar environments, established oversight. Which he walked away from, Elias replied. Rhodes's smile thinned, barely. Allegedly. Elias leaned back slightly. You're requesting transfer without patient consent. Rhodes nodded. Under guardianship, consent is implied. Orion shifted. Just a step. Nothing dramatic. Rhodes noticed. His gaze lingered a beat too long. I understand emotions are high, Rhodes continued. But this is a legal matter. Escalation benefits no one. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the urge to push, to break through the polite barrier and reach something solid beneath. Instead, he stayed still. Tomorrow, Elias said. Hearings tomorrow. Until then, he stays. Helen Crowley cleared her throat. That is the hospital's position. Rhodes smiled again. Then we'll see what the judge says. He rose, adjusted his jacket, and paused at the door. One more thing, he added. Black Pine values cooperation. Resistance has a way of complicating lives. His eyes flicked once more to Orion. Then he left. Frank watched the snow fall from his bed. "They always talk like they're doing you a favor," he said quietly. Elias nodded. "That's how you know it's not." Sarah adjusted Frank's IV, her jaw tight. "Administration's nervous," she said. "They don't like pressure." "Pressure reveals structure," Frank replied. "You push hard enough, you find out what's load-bearing." Orion rested his head against the bed frame, eyes half-lidded but alert. Just before noon, Orion rose abruptly. No sound preceded it. No footstep, no voice. He moved to the window, placing his front paws on the sill, nose pressed to the glass. His body went rigid, not aggressive, not alarmed, focused. Elias crossed the room slowly. "What is it?" Outside, in the parking lot below, a black sedan idled despite the cold. Engine running, windows tinted, no markings. A man sat in the driver's seat, phone to his ear. Eyes lifted, not to the building, but to the exact window Orion stood behind. The man did not look away. Orion's lips did not curl. He did not bark. He simply stared back. After a long moment, the sedan pulled away. Orion stepped down from the sill and returned to Frank's side, settling with deliberate calm. Elias felt something settle into place inside him. They weren't being pressured. They were being watched. The rest of the day passed in fragments, paperwork, calls. Adrian Sloan arrived with updated filings, his usual wry humor stripped down to efficiency. Mara coordinated with county clerks and a sympathetic judge's assistant. Sarah stayed late, claiming chart updates that didn't strictly require her presence. Frank dozed in the afternoon, Orion never leaving his side. Elias stepped outside once, letting the cold bite through his jacket. The town looked smaller under snow, quieter. He thought of the shed by the lake, the files, the way systems didn't need to shout to be dangerous. Night came early. Tomorrow would decide nothing fully, but it would draw a line. Elias returned to the ward, Orion rising to meet him. "Rest while you can," Frank said softly, eyes half closed. "They'll push harder next." Elias nodded. "So will we." Outside, the snow kept falling, and somewhere in the town, pressure continued to take shape. The courthouse smelled like old paper and floor polish. Elias noticed it the moment he stepped inside, the layered scent of decades of filings, boots tracking in snowmelt, coffee gone stale on radiators that clicked and sighed as they fought the cold. The building wasn't imposing. It didn't need to be. Its power lived in forms and timing, and who was allowed to speak. Orion walked at Elias's left knee, calm and composed, nails clicking softly against the stone. The German shepherd's coat looked darker in the dim light, cream and gray muted beneath the high windows. His black harness, red trim dulled by wear, fit him like intention. He wasn't tense. He was ready. Frank Halverson arrived 10 minutes later in a wheelchair pushed by Sarah Bennett. He wore a simple wool sweater over a collared shirt, and his frame still thin but steadier than it had been days ago. His beard was neatly trimmed now, his hair combed back. He looked like a man who had decided to show up as himself, not as a case. Sarah paused just inside the doors, hands resting on the chair's handles. She wore a dark coat over her scrubs, her posture upright, her expression composed. Her eyes, clear, watchful, flicked from face to face, reading the room as if it were a patient. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Frank nodded. "I've taught harder rooms than this." Mara Keene appeared from the far hallway, hat off, coat buttoned tight. She moved with the contained urgency of someone who had already spent hours managing things no one else would see. Her jaw was set, eyes focused. "They're here," she said, "and they brought weight." Elias followed her gaze. Caleb Rhodes stood near the courtroom doors, immaculate as ever, suit pressed, tie centered. Beside him was a woman Elias hadn't seen before, late 40s, tall, angular, and hair pulled into a severe twist at the back of her head. Her face was pale, sharp-boned, eyes dark and intent. She wore a charcoal coat and carried a leather portfolio held tight against her ribs like a shield. "That's Judith Hale," Adrian Sloane murmured as he joined them, voice low. "Senior counsel. Black Pine doesn't send her unless they expect resistance." Judith's gaze swept the hall, assessing, cataloging. When it landed on Frank, it paused, just a fraction too long before moving on. "They think this is theirs," Adrian added. "They think today is about reminding everyone who controls the language." Elias felt Orion's shoulder brush his leg, grounding him. "Then we speak plainly," Elias said. The courtroom was smaller than Elias expected. Wood-paneled walls, a single flag, a judge's bench worn smooth by time and elbows. The gallery filled quickly hospital staff, a few townspeople, an older man Elias recognized from the diner near the lake. A quiet curiosity hummed through the space. Judge Ellen Markham entered without ceremony. She was in her early 60s, short, with silver hair cut close to her head and eyes that missed nothing. She wore her robe like a habit rather than a costume. When she sat, the room followed. "Good morning," she said. "We are here on an emergency motion regarding guardianship and medical transfer. Let's proceed." Judith Hale stood first. Her voice was cool, controlled, each word placed with surgical precision. She spoke of fiduciary responsibility, of continuity of care, of contractual obligation. She referenced statutes and precedents with ease, her tone suggesting inevitability rather than argument. Frank listened without interruption. Elias watched the judge. Judge Markham's pen moved steadily, but her eyes flicked up at irregular intervals, not to Judith but to Frank. Judith concluded with a small nod. "Black Pine Trust requests immediate transfer to a contracted facility pending resolution." Caleb Rhodes sat back, hands folded, confident. Adrian rose next. He did not raise his voice. He spoke of patient autonomy, of documented lucidity, of procedural irregularities flagged by hospital staff. He referenced the temporary suspension already granted, the pending ethics review, the county report filed by Lila Rosen. "This court," Adrian said calmly, "is not being asked to decide ownership. It is being asked to decide voice." Judge Markham leaned back slightly. "Mr. Halverson," she said, "I'd like to hear from you." Frank closed his eyes for a moment, not in hesitation, but in centering. When he opened them, his gaze was steady. He spoke of his life in simple terms: teaching, service, the slow realization that decisions were being made without him, the moment he understood that care had become control. "I am not confused," Frank said quietly. "I am tired. There's a difference." The room held its breath. Judge Markham nodded once. "Thank you." She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Bennett?" Sarah stepped forward. She described orientation tests, consistency, recovery. She spoke with clinical clarity, but her voice carried something else, a refusal to let this man be reduced to data. "He knows where he is," Sarah concluded. "He knows why he's here. And he knows what he wants." Judge Markham made a note. Then she looked at Elias. "You are not counsel," she said. But you are present. Yes, Your Honor. Why? Elias didn't overthink it. Because he asked me to stay, he said, and because sometimes systems need witnesses. Judge Markham studied him for a long moment. Orion sat at Elias's feet, still as carved stone. The clerk called a brief recess. People stood, murmured, shifted. Papers rustled. Somewhere a phone vibrated and was quickly silenced. Orion rose. Not abruptly, deliberately. He moved a step forward, positioning himself between Frank and the aisle. His ears angled back. Body loose but alert. He did not block anyone. He simply occupied space that had been empty a moment before. Judith Hale paused mid-step. Her eyes dropped to the dog. Something flickered across her face. Not fear, but calculation interrupted. For the first time since entering the room, her posture adjusted, shoulders tightening. "Is the dog a problem?" she asked, voice clipped. Judge Markham looked down from the bench. "No," the judge said. "He's sitting." Orion sat. The moment passed, but it left a mark. The judge returned. She folded her hands. "This court recognizes the urgency claimed by the petitioner," she said. "However, urgency does not override credibility." Judith straightened. "Given the testimony," Judge Markham continued, "the documented lucidity, and the ongoing reviews already in motion, I am denying the request for immediate transfer." A ripple moved through the gallery. Frank exhaled slowly. "This guardianship remains suspended pending full review," the judge added. "Mr. Halverson will remain at the current facility under hospital care." Judith's jaw tightened. Caleb Rhodes's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. Judge Markham's gaze sharpened. "Additionally, this court is ordering an independent audit of fiduciary actions taken under this guardianship." That landed. Judith opened her mouth, then closed it. "This hearing is adjourned," Judge Markham said. The gavel struck once. Outside, the cold felt different, sharper, cleaner. Snow fell in fine grains now, carried sideways by wind. Elias stood on the courthouse steps, breath steaming. Orion pressed close. Frank was wrapped in a blanket, Sarah's hand steady on the chair. Mara joined them, a rare smile breaking through her reserve. "You held the line." "For now," Adrian said. "They'll appeal, delay, dig." Frank looked up at Elias. "I've lived long enough to know that when people like them start digging, they usually uncover more than they intend." Judith Hale passed them on the steps without looking back. Caleb Rhodes followed, phone already at his ear. Orion watched them go, head tilted slightly, as if committing their silhouettes to memory. Elias felt the strange calm that came not from victory, but from alignment. The record had spoken, and for once it had told the truth. The town did not celebrate. There were no banners on lampposts, no bells rung from the church by the square. Victory, if it could be called that, arrived the way winter sunlight did in the north, quietly, without ceremony, touching only what stood still long enough to feel it. Elias noticed this as he drove back from the courthouse. Snow lined the roads in uneven banks, pushed aside by plows that had done their work hours earlier. The sky was pale, stretched thin and colorless, the kind of sky that made distances feel longer than they were. Orion lay in the back seat, head resting between his paws, eyes half open. Not asleep. Never fully asleep. The truck heater hummed. The world felt held together by small, functioning things. At the hospital, the air felt lighter. Not warmer, just less burdened. as nurses moved with less tension in their shoulders. Conversations were shorter, cleaner. Paperwork still existed, but it no longer pressed in from all sides like a closing door. Frank Halverson sat by the window in his room, a blanket folded neatly across his legs. He wore a button-down shirt now, sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing skin still thin but no longer ashen. The bronze star was gone from the bedside table. In its place sat a paperback book and a pair of reading glasses. "You look like a man who expects to be interrupted," Frank said, without turning, as Elias entered. "I usually am," Elias replied. Orion padded in behind him, tail giving a single, slow sweep against the doorframe before he moved to Frank's side. He sat, close but not touching, presence solid and patient. Frank looked down at him and smiled. "You're quieter than most people I've known." Orion's ears flicked. Sarah Bennett appeared a moment later, carrying a clipboard she didn't really need. She leaned against the counter instead of standing at attention, posture looser now that the worst of the storm had passed. In daylight, her features softened, still sharp, still observant, but no longer braced for impact. Her dark blonde hair was down today, brushing her shoulders, the faintest hint of a wave suggesting she didn't often have time to notice it. "They're finalizing discharge planning," she said. "Not today, but soon." Frank nodded. "I'm not in a hurry." Sarah smiled faintly. "That might be the healthiest thing I've heard all week." The days that followed unfolded without drama. That, Elias realized, was the point. Auditors arrived quiet people with careful eyes and neutral expressions. Files were requested. Questions were asked in tones that suggested answers were already expected. Black Pine Trust did not vanish, but it receded. Its presence felt more in absence than assertion. Caleb Rhodes did not return. Judith Hale sent a letter formal, yes, restrained, acknowledging the court's direction and asserting cooperation. Adrian Sloane read it once, snorted softly, and filed it without comment. "Language retreating," Adrian said. "That's how you know it worked." Mara Keene stopped by the hospital one afternoon, hat tucked under her arm, coat dusted with snow. She stood at the foot of Frank's bed, hands on her hips. "You staying out of trouble?" she asked. Frank smiled. "I'm considering writing a letter to my congressman." Mara groaned. "Let's not get carried away." She nodded once at Elias, once at Orion, and left without another word. The town resumed its rhythms. At the diner, people talked about weather again. About roads, about the high school game scheduled for Friday night. The shed by the lake remained closed, its door rehung properly now, the files inside catalogued and removed. It looked like what it had always been. An old building no one noticed unless they needed to. Elias noticed it anyway. Frank's last night in the hospital, the snow stopped. The silence that followed felt deeper for it, as if the world had leaned in closer. Moonlight spilled across the parking lot, pale and clean, reflecting off patches of ice that hadn't yet melted. Elias sat in the chair beside Frank's bed, jacket folded over the back, hands resting loosely on his thighs. Orion lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes tracking the slow movement of light across the wall. Frank broke the quiet first. "Do you know what scared me most?" he asked. Elias waited. "Not losing the money," Frank continued. "Not the house. It was the moment I realized people were talking about me as if I wasn't there. As if I'd already become a story someone else could finish." Elias nodded. "That's how systems work when they forget why they exist." Frank smiled faintly. You don't sound like a man who learned that from a book. No, sir. They sat with that. After a while, and Frank reached down and rested his hand on Orion's head. The dog didn't move, didn't lean in. He simply accepted the contact, warmth passing between skin and fur. You know, Frank said, I used to tell my students that history isn't about dates. It's about what people choose to remember when the noise fades. Elias watched Orion's chest rise and fall. What will you remember? Frank looked out the window. That I wasn't alone when it mattered. Just before midnight, Orion lifted his head. Not sharply. Not urgently. He turned his gaze toward the window, ears angling, nose drawing in a slow breath. Elias followed his line of sight. Outside, the moon slipped behind a thin veil of cloud, dimming the light in the room. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the cloud passed. The light returned, unchanged. Orion lowered his head again, satisfied. Frank exhaled softly. For a second, he murmured, I thought something was going to happen. Elias shook his head. Something already did. Frank left the hospital 3 days later. No cameras waited. No crowd gathered. Just Sarah walking beside the wheelchair, Elias carrying a small bag, and Orion pacing ahead, checking the path as if this, too, were an operation that required attention. The air outside was sharp, but kind. The kind of cold that reminded you were alive. A short-term housing arrangement had been made. An apartment overlooking the river, close enough to town to matter, far enough to breathe. Frank stood in the doorway, taking in the space slowly. The light, the quiet, the ordinary furniture that waited without expectation. This will do, he said. Sarah smiled. You say that like you're grading it. Old habits, Frank replied. She lingered a moment, then reached out and squeezed his shoulder. You call if you need anything, even if you don't. I will. When she left, Elias stood awkwardly near the door. You don't have to stay, Frank said gently. I know. They stood there, two men unsure how to end something that hadn't been a mission, exactly, but had required the same parts of themselves. Frank extended his hand. Elias took it. Thank you, Frank said. Elias shook his head once. You spoke for yourself. Frank smiled. You stayed long enough for me to do it. Orion sat between them, looking up as if committing the moment to memory. Elias drove out of town that afternoon. The road wound north, past trees stripped bare by winter, past fields lying fallow beneath thin snow. The sky opened wider the farther he went, light spreading without urgency. Orion watched the passing world, ears flicking at distant sounds, crows, wind, the low murmur of the river they crossed once, twice. Elias didn't know where they were going next. He knew only that they would stop when Orion told him to. And somewhere behind them, the town returned to its quiet routines. Systems recalibrated, files changed hands, names were written correctly this time. And one man, no longer reduced to paperwork, stood in his own space and watched the light move across the floor. What remained, Elias thought, wasn't justice in the grand sense. It was presence. It was staying. It was knowing when to listen to an animal who could sense the truth before words ever reached it. The truck disappeared down the road, leaving nothing behind but tracks that would be gone by morning. And that, Elias knew, was enough. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they arrive quietly in the form of a pause, a presence, a moment when someone chooses not to walk away. Maybe it was not coincidence that a man stopped his car that morning. Maybe it was not instinct alone that guided a loyal dog to where a life was fading. And maybe, just maybe, God still works the way He always has. Through ordinary steps, ordinary courage, and hearts willing to listen. In our daily lives, we pass countless moments like that. A stranger who needs help, a truth that asks us to speak up, a voice inside that says, "Stay, pay attention." Most of the time, the miracle is not what happens next. The miracle is that we noticed at all. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you to look again, to care again, or to stand still when the world rushes past, then let that feeling move beyond the screen. Share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt or what you believe miracles look like in your own life. Subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can continue to be told. And wherever you are, whoever you are, may God watch over you, may He guide your steps, and may He place you at the right moment where your presence can become someone else's miracle.